tutorial, and in this particular discussion I'll be talking about the types of the microscopes that we have, and I would be introducing you to the parts of the microscope and what specific functions they would be performing. And so you're looking forward to having a very interesting experience today, and I would urge you to like this video, share and subscribe to this channel for more interesting conversations on the things that really matter a lot to you. And so let's face it, we've talked about the evolution of the microscope and how the whole journey started, but let's look at the various parts of the microscope. So this is a compound microscope, a very small microscope of mine, and I'm going to use this as a model in the discussion. I know that in your classes you've already gone more deeper into these things, and so let's, for the purposes of this discussion, revisit this. This is a monocular microscope because it has just one eyepiece lens. Most of the microscopes that you've seen are binocular microscope because then they have two eyepiece lenses, but this just has one. So this is an eyepiece lens. It is a lens that is going to enable you to see the final image that you're forming in the microscope. And these are your objective lenses. These are the lenses that pick up the details from the specimen. So most microscopes would have 3 or 4 objective lenses. This one has 3. And mostly you have the scanning objective lens, you have the low power, you have the high power, and then you have the oil immersion lens. We'll talk exclusively about the oil immersion lens and the various types of objective lenses in a dedicated tutorial for magnification. And so let's expect that. This is the stage of the microscope, the stage. So the specimen is actually placed on this stage. This is the stage on which the specimen is placed. Then the objective lens looks directly on the specimen, placed on the stage. Then beneath the stage, you have the diaphragm, which is used to control how much light would enter the condenser lens. And note that the condenser lens is just right at the stage. On the stage is the condenser lens. So the light ray coming from this source, this is the light source. Light passes through the diaphragm, allowing the light to pass through, then gets through the condenser lens and comes through the objective lens, picks it, the image is formed, and afterwards you see it in the eyepiece lens. So once again, I've talked about the eyepiece lens, I've talked about the objective lenses, the condenser lens, the diaphragm just beneath the stage, and then the light source. So these are basically the part of the microscope that you need to know. And you should also know the various forms of adjustments. So we have, this is a fine adjustment for knob for this microscope, and then this is the rough adjustment. And they are mostly used for focusing the microscope, and most modern microscopes have different design from what I have here. And so let's continue. The next thing is with the classifications of microscope, and I must say that this is an area that has received a lot of controversy, because then you'll be searching online and you'll be finding different classifications, you'll be finding different type of microscopes at different times. This is the whole thing, and let's demystify that particular confusion. The point is, depending on what criteria you are using for your classification, we would continue to have different types of microscopes, and that's the point. So what I'll do is that I would give out those specific criteria, and at best take the various types of microscope you have under those particular considerations, then we talk about them and conclude this particular lesson. And so based on the kind of medium that the microscope is using, you can have the light microscope or the electron microscope. That is to say that the light microscope is using electromagnetic rays, that's light, as the mode of operation, whilst the electron microscope are passing beams of electrons through a specimen whatsoever. So based on that consideration, we have two types: the light microscope, the electron microscope. Under electron microscope, we have two types of electron microscopes. We have the scanning electron microscope and we have the transmission electron microscope. What scanning electron microscope will do is that it will focus beams of electrons onto a specimen. That would only allow us to see the external details on the specimen and not the internal structures of that specimen. So for example, you want to examine pollen grains, the morphological features of certain specimen, then the scanning electron microscope will be much more ideal. But instances where you want to see internal details, you want to see internal structures, then you would have to use the transmission electron microscope, which allows you to pass electrons through ultra thin cut sections of specimen, and that is it. Under simple light microscopes too, you can have the normal light microscope, compound light microscope, and then you can have the dissecting microscope. But even before you get to the compound microscope, note that it is compound because it's using a combination of lenses. We also have simple microscopes, light microscope, that are just using just one lens. For example, the hand lens and then the loose, those just use one lens. So under light microscope, you have simple using one lens, and then compound using a system of lenses. Under compound, you have the normal compound light microscope and you have the dissecting microscope. The normal compound light microscopes that you have would, just like the transmission electron microscope, allow you to pass light rays through the specimen to view internal structures. What the dissecting microscope will do is to allow you to see just the external features of the specimen. And so the light rays doesn't pass through the specimen. It's just projected onto the specimen and you're able to see. Under the normal compound microscope, you can have several techniques, several different types of microscopes, and we will be talking about each of them exclusively. You can have the UV microscope that is using ultraviolet light instead of the normal visible light. You can have UV fluorescence microscope that is combining the principle of fluorescence with the UV radiations to view things within a microscope. You can have the phase contrast microscope, which for the first time is helping us to increase on our contrasts significantly. Then you have the dark field and what have you. We will take all of them independently and talk about them. So today we talked about the part of the microscope, we talked about the various classifications of microscope that we have, and in subsequent lessons we'll be taking each of these types of microscopes and going into details. Thank you very much for watching, and subscribe to this channel for more interesting updates.